Hey Josh, you ever been watching a kids' TV show like SpongeBob and wonder how in the world with how immature those characters are that society functions? I think that might be closer to reality than we want to think. Yeah.
Jumped the gun on the video a little bit. Sorry.
I think that might be closer to reality than we want to think though. So that's what we're going to talk about today. I'm Pastor Ben Olschlager, coming to you from the great state of Michigan. With me again, as always, Pastor Josh Laborious of
From the greater state of Texas.
except Alaska thinks they're better because
Well,
everything's
I mean,
actually
Alaska
bigger
and
in
Texas are
Alaska.
both allowed to be better than Michigan.
Eh.
Eh.
If you go to Alaska and you buy a Texas-sized cinnamon roll, it's small.
And you know what? That's hilarious.
Anyway, yeah, we're talking about maturity and the way that it impacts the church. And the reason I started with the cold open, and Josh and I were talking about this before the episode, there are many ways that a lack of maturity in people, in their faith, in their personality, in all sorts of things, can really make ministry challenging. And we just want to unpack some of those today. But before we dive into that, we want to talk about why that might be more of a challenge for the modern church than it has been in the past. And yeah, Josh, do you want to start on this, or do you want me to kind of start to unpack this?
I can start because I think, honestly, you have a stronger approach to it. So
Sure,
I'll ease us in and then you can give maybe a more robust contribution. Okay.
sure. That's
I think that,
asking a lot.
yes, I am. That's the theme of the episode.
Yeah.
We're apparently asking for a lot. I think some of what contributes to this immaturity, I mean, to put it more bluntly, for how many people can't just act like adults.
Mm.
I think part of what feeds into this, and I'm sure that there is a lot that feeds into this, right? You could say everything from parenting trends to media portrayals of different figures feed into this. But I think a big part of it is the reality that I think we as a society are a little coddled in that if you complain enough or you complain to the right person, even if your suffering is 100% your fault, someone is going to step in and help you out. And an example I will use, but I hesitate to use because I know my brother's going to give me crap and he listens to these podcasts. Okay. Last month, I submitted a credit card payment on the day it was due. But that day was a weekend, so the payment didn't really process until it was late. My fault. I should have paid it earlier. I should have paid it a day or two ahead of time. Whatever. Okay. They hit me with an interest payment because the payment was late and it processed the balance before the balance was paid off. And they also hit me with a late fee. So I hopped on a chat with Citi yesterday and I was like, here's how I phrase it, because the guy on the other side of the chat, it wasn't his fault. I said something along the lines of, I know it's not your fault. I know you don't make policies, but this policy, I think, is a little greedy, a little ruthless, and stupid. Like, if you hit me with a late fee and I paid it, you shouldn't also hit me with interest. Pick one or the other, which isn't. It's totally reasonable. This is the policy. These are the rules that I signed, but I complained. And he waived the interest and the late fee penalty because I complained. 100% my fault. 100% on me. The penalty was waived because I complained loudly enough, which it wasn't that loudly. It was like 2 sentences in a chat box. But this is our society. If you miss a deadline, you just sweet talk your teacher or your boss. If you don't read an email, for some reason, we never blame you for not reading the email. And it's like, in that way, we are very much coddled. Very much coddled. And I think there's a lot that marketing feeds into that. How if you miss one thing, there's another communication, right? Like there's so many things that feed into that. But the reality is I think we're coddled. And I think that feeds into this kind of perpetual immaturity that we have in as Christians in America. And
Mm-hmm.
this isn't even one of the things seminary doesn't talk about enough. There is no conversation about how do you pull people kicking and screaming into some maturity. And we're not necessarily talking about maturity of faith, although there's some of that as well. We're talking about just like being an adult.
Mm-hmm.
Some of you listening are going to cringe at this, but I'm talking about adulting things. And if you're older and you're shaking your head and you're saying the younger generation doesn't get this, you need to calm down, because the worst people about it sometimes are the older generation. So get off your high horse. What else contributes to it? Goes hand in hand with this, Ben.
Yeah, I mean, I think about, so I want to put an asterisk on what you just said. I think there are some of the worst contributors are older folks, but some of the people who actually have maturity are also older folks.
Correct.
Like, I think some of the people that I know as adults that have the most maturity are also adults. And I think it just kind of comes down to the circumstances that you have been exposed to. Just
sure.
about anybody that I know that grew up on a farm has a greater level of maturity than almost anybody I know that grew up in a city. Like, there's a level to which I think people who do a lot of labor or work in their middle, high school, college years, those people tend to understand more about the consequences of actions in life than people who, I mean, even if you had a job like working at McDonald's or
I would say, as far as the people I've known who have worked minimum wage jobs,
mm,
have a greater maturity or greater appreciation for these kinds of things than like the people I went to school with at Vanderbilt, who had never worked a day in their lives, and they
mhm,
continue to not work a day in their lives. I said this flippantly, but at Vanderbilt, one of my things is like, I think everyone should have to work a semester at a minimum wage job just so they actually know what it's like when they're terrible to these people who are,
mhm.
working at McDonald's or working at campus dining or whatever else. So I think you're right. I by no means want to say everyone in our society is coddled and immature. That's not true. It definitely depends on where you grew up, how you grew up, the different environments you've been in throughout your life. Like, that's without a doubt part of it.
Yeah, but with all that being said, there are a lot of people who just haven't had to face any real sort of kind of shaping adversity in their life. And it doesn't have to be big things. Like, it doesn't have to be,
You ran for your life against an enemy warlord.
yeah, like, not we're not necessarily thinking about the kinds of things that we see in the early church, right? We're not thinking about, facing persecution for the faith. We're not thinking about the fact that diseases or that vaccines didn't exist, so you died of dysentery. We're not thinking about the fact that, like, I think even to this day, the average age of every human ever to live is still like 7 years old or something like that.
That's
Because so,
depressing.
right? Because so many kids died either during the childbirthing process, during their first couple of years of life while their immune systems were picking up. Like, I think Luther had like 7 kids and like 3 reached adulthood. Like, you don't even have to go that through that kind of thing to recognize that there's a need for maturity, that there's a need for responsibility, that there's a need for being better than what we've kind of been discipled to be by our culture. And this is something that I'm wrestling with myself. I recognize this in myself. Like, grew up,
If you're watching the video, see his tag.
yeah. To be fair, most of the emails that I leave unread, I should say pretty much all of the emails that I leave unread are promotional ones that I just don't take the time to delete. It is what it
I
is.
can't fathom. I can't fathom. It bothers me so much to have emails in my inbox.
Anyway, I know this is something I'm still improving on, and I will own that. But I also know that, like, there are people who don't recognize that this is a problem, and to me, that's sadder.
Yes.
And I mean, okay, so I saw an article earlier today. I was reading through X, aka Twitter, aka sometimes. Um, mostly on there for sports news, but I follow a few of our friends and classmates from the seminary on there. And a couple of them reposted an article. According to some recent statistics, um, decline in the church amongst young people has pretty much bottomed out and is actually starting to reverse, which I
That
think a lot of churches are seeing that.
tracks with my experience. Yeah.
Yeah, a lot of churches are seeing like the kind of slipping away that a lot of young people were doing has more or less stopped, and a lot of younger people and families are coming back to churches because they recognize there's something else that they need and that they want.
Well,
And I
and
think
not
a big
only
part of
that.
that is, if I can say this and I'll pass it back to you here,
Yeah, go ahead.
I think a big part of that is we're kind of coming to the end of everything's just on a silver platter. When the average college graduate comes out of school with tens of thousands of dollars in debt, when you can't just like drive down the street, put a paycheck put a paycheck down as a down payment on a house, and call it a day. When there is an incredible amount of injustice in the way that our economy works, like there are a lot of things that are screwy about the way that, not just in the United States, but internationally, the way that our world works. I think people are starting to wake up to the fact that we need to be more adults about this situation and we can't just ride this out.
Yeah. Well,
So
and
what do we do about it?
I think there is also in my experience, it's not just young people coming to church. It's young people who are like hungry for it,
Mm,
who aren't just, they aren't just the young families that I've met here so far. They're not just here to check a box.
hmm
They're wanting to grow. They are wanting to be fed and challenged. They're wanting their kids to be fed and challenged, which is awesome, which is
hmm
incredible to see. But I think you're right. I think there is a little bit of a shift, but I do think that shift has only gone so far. I think we got plenty of room to grow
Oh, heck yeah. Heck
across
yeah.
all generation. Again, across all generations, right?
Yeah. I'm just saying, like, I think we've had, if you kind of think back since, we'll say, like the 50s or 60s, get out of the depression, get out of the post World War II rationing, when things in the United States started to be kind of generally pretty good. And this is, again, speaking broadly, I recognize this isn't the same everywhere, all the same, or all the time, all at once. But since about 1960, up until the last few years, it was pretty easy to kind of skate through life in the United States. And I think we're seeing the impact of that in our churches. And I don't know about you, Josh, but I think the place that I see the impact of that most is in church leadership. Because the thing that most churches struggle with is replacing the leaders that have been around for 40, 50
20,
years.
30, 40, 50, how many years? Yeah.
Yeah. Like it used to be when people expected to live to 50, 60, 70 years old, talking 100 years ago. If you made it through childhood, if you made it through your 20s, 30s, you were probably going to make it to about 65. So people would be kind of conditioned to step up early in life. If you're in your late 20s, 30s, you're at the right age to lead in a church, in a municipality, whatever the case may be. But as people keep living longer, and I think the generation that we kind of see is the oldest generation, or the couple oldest generations in the church right now, were right at the forefront of that, where their life expectancy when they were born was probably 15, 20 years shorter than what it is now. That's encouraged the generations behind them to think that they don't really have to step up because
Well,
the same
and
people can just keep doing what they're doing. And we think they're probably going to live long enough to make that happen.
yes, and I mean, and this is a cycle you see in like this. This is the exact cycle you see in Israel in the Old Testament. We had this era of prosperity, and we tend to focus less on God. We
Mm-hmm.
tend to focus less on what I would what I'm going to call, and there are a lot of other ways we could cut this, but deep discipleship.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just going to say it. There are ways you can mishear this. I don't care. Okay, the Jesus movement and the church growth movement. I think in a lot of ways we settled for shallow discipleship because it felt good. We settled on ways of serving people that felt good rather than thinking about how can we actually do good, do right by these people. We settled for ways of doing church, whether that's worship or Bible class or discipleship or whatever else, that were fun, that were very attractive, and they felt good to engage with, but it wasn't challenging us. It wasn't deepening our discipleship. And I think, just like what happened with Israel, we've reached the point where we can look and we can say, wow, we messed up.
Yeah.
Because we're starting to reap the consequences of decades of shallow discipleship.
Yeah.
And kind of a positive turn to this is, at least in what I am looking out and seeing, is I am starting to see a turn of people who say, I don't want what is comfortable. I want what is right or good or like what is actually going to help disciple me. And I think that's a positive. And like we've said before, that like we haven't completely turned the corner, but I do think this is a trend we're starting to. I mean, and my filter's going to keep that comment to myself. Actually, that might be the first
Probably
on
for the
this
best.
show. Holy cow! Mark the date down.
Date, timestamp in the episode.
Josh's filter actually stopped something from making it onto the air. Look
Hey.
at that.
Maturity, Josh.
No one's ever accused me of that.
Yeah. So, like, I think Josh is absolutely right that there is a cultural lull that's just kind of happened in our society that's led us to a shallowness in a lot of different ways. Because that was so pervasive for such a long time, I think people were afraid to push. Because if you pushed, people fled. And if people fled, I mean, if you're a pastor and your people flee, there's only so long you can go before you're not a pastor.
And I think you're 100% right. And I do think people are still there. There's definitely still that we're afraid to push because we're afraid we're going to push people away. If you find if you're listening to this and you're like, yeah, what I would encourage you is to give people a little bit more credit. Because in my experience, more often, and you got to see last week's episode on reading context, because some people aren't there. But in my experience, more often than not, when you push, people rise to the occasion. It's just you have to be willing to push. And in some cases, you have to be willing to let consequences do their job. You guys might, for those of you who don't know, I have a son. He's about 1.5 years old. He's adorable. And he does things that he shouldn't do, and we tell him not to do. For one of the examples, we have a couch. It's a sectional couch. It's shaped like a big old L, I guess. I mean, an L with both sides equal, but that's not important. And he has developed a habit of running on the couch. And we say, Zeke, don't do that. You're going to fall off the couch. It's going to hurt. He continues to run. And a couple times, he falls off. And he's bonked his noggin a couple times as he falls off the couch, like, because he'll hit the table that is in the middle of the couch. And here's the reality. Part of me is like, now we comfort him and we check to make sure he's okay. So don't call me a bad parent. I'm trying my best. But there is an element toward natural consequences are teaching you a lesson. And we're not gonna move the table. We do have padding on the table so it doesn't like split his head straight open. But I think there does have to be an element of we're letting consequences teach lessons. Because I think some of the problems that we're seeing are because we removed consequences from a lot of situations. It's like, hey, you didn't read that email and you missed the event. Sucks to be you. Like natural consequences.
Yeah.
So that's where we're at. Are we ready to transition into, because we've been talking very kind of high level immaturity. What is it? Where does it come from? What are the trends we're seeing? I'm ready to get into how does this actually play out in ministry and
we've already started that. We've already started that. I already talked about
a little bit. I have some specific complaints I would like to air.
I started with my specific complaints about not finding leaders. So
okay, that's fair.
Go ahead and fire off your second one here, Josh.
Okay. And I mentioned it. Read your freaking emails.
Yeah.
Okay. If I send out 3 emails, a text message, and I announce it in worship, and it was in the bulletin, You do not have any right to tell me we didn't know about this. That is on you. That is your fault, not mine. I'm not going to say which one because I do have a couple previous ministry contexts, and this is a negative thing, so we're going to keep it anonymous. I did at one point have someone complain to me, like, we have nothing going on for this age group. And I was like, what are you talking about? We have like 3 events a month for that age group. You don't come to church, you don't listen to the announcements, you don't read your emails, you don't check your texts. I cannot do anything more for you other than going into your house, kicking down the door, and writing it on your calendar for you. Read your email. Ladies and gentlemen, at Hope Lutheran Church, I'm going to address my congregation here. So I'll put on my calm, mature pastor face. Read the blast on Thursdays. I know it has gotten long lately. Your new pastor has a lot of announcements that he has put in. Take the 4 whole minutes out of your life that it will take to read it top to bottom and read it, not asking for that much. It really should only take you 4 to 5 minutes. If you're a really slow reader, maybe it'll take you 10 minutes. And if you're like, I get more emails than that, if you get more emails than that, it is because you sign up for them and you quite literally ask for them. 1 email a week. Read it. And if I send you an email asking you a question, this isn't really a complaint because everyone's pretty good about this so far. If I have a question and I email you about it, that's because I do need your input or your feedback. So reply! Even if it's a reply like, I want to think about this, can you like get back to me in a week or something?
Mm-hmm.
That's fine. Read your emails, reply to your emails. This is my wish for maturity in the world. And it's not just congregationally, but like, they never mention that in seminary. How do you get people to reply to emails? How do you get people to be informed? It's like, I don't know, man. Maybe I have to take the Jeff Schrank approach, and every time I have an announcement, I get a different ridiculous costume to wear and make it. I'm going to come in one day dressed like a giant inflatable pig to announce Friendship Sunday. Maybe then people will remember. And again, if you're listening and you're from Hope, you're like, oh, what do you mean? We've been trying to be like, this has been building for a decade. Folks, this is not necessarily frustration at Hope. I haven't been here long enough to be frustrated by lack of responsiveness or people not reading their emails. But keep up the good work, I guess, would be my instruction there. All right. Glad I got that off my chest. I feel better. You listening to this, you might feel a little guilty. And if you do better. And then you won't feel guilty anymore. But I feel better, so that's good. What's next, Ben?
Well, I want to make an addendum to that. If your church puts together a newsletter or has a schedule of events on the bulletin or like makes an effort to communicate, pay attention to that. Yeah. Anyway, where else does this?
It's okay. We can have airtime because the software we use now will automatically remove pauses. So as you're listening to this, you're like, what do you mean? What pause? There was a pause.
I think the next one that comes to mind for me is priorities and how our immaturity has shaped our priorities.
Oh, man. You're hitting a good one.
Yeah. I don't care about your round of golf. I don't care about your ski trip. I don't care that much about your kid's basketball game. I care about
more about that than the other stuff because I care about your kid.
Yeah, I care about you getting into heaven. I just wish that more people felt the same way.
I'm going to pile onto this because this is where I was thinking I was going to go next. It is audacious for us to say this, but it is true nonetheless. Your faith, our faith, is the most important thing. Like, if you're a parent listening to this, the most important thing to give your child growing up is a foundation in the faith. The most important thing you do in the week are those things you do which build up your faith. So this is going to church. This is Bible studies you might be engaged with. This is fellowship with the church and building that community so you have that support. Personal devotions, prayers. And I think I've stopped doing this because even though I am only 29, I have the soul of a crotchety 8-year-old. Not just a regular 8-year-old, like a particularly crotchety one.
Josh, my nickname has been Grandpa since I was 19.
Yeah, that tracks. And I've reached a point where I'm like, I'm over it. I am not going to pretend that asking you to show up in worship every week is some great, huge thing for me to ask. It is 2 hours a week. You spend more time than that on your phone not on a week, on a day. Like, I suspect a lot of us, if you look at your phone right now and you say, well, how much time have I spent on just the social media apps? I'm guessing you're getting close. It should not be this big, dramatic, pastor's asking me to be in worship every single week. Are you kidding me? That's not a big ask. That used to be like the assumed, and everything else was extra. I'm not a good old days person, but like, come on now. I'm not asking for that much. And frankly, while I'm on that one, asking you to stay for Bible study also is not this big dramatic thing. For us, if you should, at least right now, we have worship at 9:00 and we have Bible study at 10:45. I am done by 11:45. So if you stay for worship and Bible study and a little bit of fellowship in between those two, you are here for less than 3 hours out of your day. So say you're awake for 15 hours a day, which I think is fairly, like, that's saying you get 9 hours of sleep a night, which is more than most of us get. If you're awake for 15 hours and I'm asking for 3 of them, I'm asking for 20% of one of your days. This is not an unreasonable thing for the most important thing, right? For building your faith and strengthening your faith. I agree with you, Ben, wholeheartedly. Holy crap, do I agree with you.
I have been a little bit encouraged in this one too recently. I was having confirmation yesterday with my 2 confirmands, and we were talking about the Lord's Prayer, and we were talking about prayer habits. And they both stopped to tell me about their family's prayer habits. And they were good. And I loved that. And I see priorities in the right place sometimes.
Yeah. Well, and I think there is room for balance here. Okay? If you miss once in a quarter, or like you miss from time to time, life happens. And I do get, and here is the thing. Okay, Sunday morning, like we should not idolize what happens on Sunday morning. Okay, I'll take this example. If your wife or your husband is in the hospital, don't leave them just to come to church. Especially now, if they're stable and they're going to be there a while, it might be a good thing that you can go to church, you can get support, you can pray together for the hospital thing. But like, if your family is having an emergency, deal with it. Go be a good father or a good wife or a good husband or a good mother. Like, live out your discipleship. Church should never be an excuse for you to not do what God has called you. So we're not saying there are no exceptions. But it is this, well, and this plays into your witness a little bit too. So I'm probably about to tip over a golden calf. So sorry in advance. But like, if your kid is in I'm not going to be specific either, just some kids' sports, and the coach goes up to you and says, we're going to practice on Sundays. Say no, my kid will not practice on Sundays. And here's the thing, that might hurt, because that might mean your kid doesn't get to play that sport this season. Or that might mean that your kid doesn't get the same amount of playing time. And that's going to be a hard conversation, but that is what an incredible witness to your kid, because you were willing to say, no, this other thing we do is more important, because it is. What an incredible witness to the other parents who might say, well, why isn't so-and-so playing this year? And you say, well, we wanted to make sure they were in this environment to support their family. And like, while we're talking about the sports thing, like, if your kid is doing sports and you have to miss a weekend because there's a tournament and it's like kind of a one-off thing, I'm not going to fault you really heavily for that, because that is it's an exciting thing for the kid. It's a way that you can build your relationship and kind of be a very supportive figure, and that can be helpful, and that can be an expression of your discipleship. But if it's like, oh, during this season we miss all the time, I'm going to fault you a little bit more for that one. And it happens with adults too. I mean, golf, or Ben mentioned the golf thing. If you're so caught up in your football team that you're skipping church to go watch football, this is a problem. The NFL is not more important than your eternal salvation. Sorry. This might be this, because of those comments alone, that last 5 minutes, this might be the spiciest episode we have ever recorded.
Possibly.
Which is wild.
Possibly. Yeah.
Anything else on that particular frustration?
No. I've got one more if we want to take a couple minutes to touch on it.
I go for it. I don't think none of the others are really like jumping out at me.
Sure. So my last one is just community. Immaturity impacts the way we do community. Basically, like when we're not willing to acknowledge that we're adults who have real adult complex feelings, who struggle with things, who face a lot of gray in a world where we wish things were black and white, who live in a world that's messy, we can't really do Christian community. I think of a lot of the things that we do as the church, and I think there's a lot of really, really good things that we do as a church. But how often do you sit down with somebody at church and you go, "How are you?" They say, "I'm good." "How are you?" You say, "You're good." And then the conversation just kind of dies there. How often do you sit down and you go, "How are you doing?" And I mean, how are you really doing? Not just like, "Oh, I'm good," or "I'm busy," or "I'm tired." It's not a good enough answer. And then we just unpack the baggage that's in our soul. Do you feel like you can do that in your church? If not, we might be struggling with an immaturity in our community.
Yeah. I think there is definitely there's an immaturity of we're only willing to deal with one another on a shallow level.
Mm.
I think that is true, but something I want to contribute to that is, and it kind of bleeds in a little bit to the last one, just a little bit into the last one. I think it is hard if you don't spend the time to build the community in the first place. Because sharing when you're struggling with strangers is a very different thing than sharing it with a community that you've built over time and you're with people a lot. So that's something, if you're like, I don't feel comfortable sharing this kind of stuff at church, don't start saying, I just need to share it. I would encourage you start building those relationships in the community with a willingness to do that.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's one of those things where it's a problem, but it's hard to figure out chicken or egg, like which comes first. And I think in that vein, we kind of got to work from both ends at the same time. I will say, Ben, we're going to wrap up. I think this is probably our last one. You mentioning that did remind me of another thing that hopefully it's a short one. As far as like immaturity and where I would just say act like adults, 2 places. First, conflict. If you have a problem with someone, you don't go and talk to your friends. We're not middle school girls. Not to say middle school. Anyway, we're not middle schoolers. You don't gossip around. If you have a problem with someone, you should go talk to them. This is what Matthew 18 tells us to do. This is how the Bible talks about dealing with conflict. Go talk to them. Okay, I'm sitting here in my office. If you come down this hallway and you have a conflict with someone, my first instruction to you is going to be, have you talked to them about it? I'm happy to be a kind of a neutral third party to help mediate conflict, but you need to take the one-on-one step first. So dealing with conflict, we need to be more mature about. And also, on the flip side, willing to deal with it. Don't just bury it. Responsible adults should deal with conflict. And then the second is how some people think it's okay to treat church workers. Like, if you have ever come into a church worker's office and just like yelled at them, this is not a mature way to handle disagreement or conflict or whatever the issue is. That's called a temper tantrum. And as from a child psychology perspective, if temper tantrums persist after 3 or 4, there is something wrong with the emotional development. Because once you have temper tantrums at their core come from a lack of language skills to express negative emotions. For those of you who didn't know that, like, that's why kids throw temper tantrums. It's because they have an inability to express themselves, so they just throw a fit. And if they do it, the older you get, the more it should be, you don't throw a temper tantrum, you communicate your displeasure or your frustration or your anger or whatever. Okay? So if you're listening to this, don't do it on my watch. I have very little patience for it. Just because it's a church doesn't mean the rules of society don't apply. You don't get to yell at church workers you disagree with. You get to go and have a conversation like an adult. If you're like, well, I yell at other adults too. You should not do that either. Adults do not yell at each other. We discuss things in a calm and in a patient way. Okay? And you can disagree and you can have conflict and we can have those conversations, but they should be in our inside voices. Don't throw temper tantrums. And if you're like, if you disagree with that statement, if you are listening to this and you're like, no, I should be able to go in and yell at church people. No. Period. No, you shouldn't. Don't. It's not okay. Whoever told you was acceptable, was incorrect. It is immaturity. We shouldn't do it. It's not who we're called to be. It's not how we're called to interact with each other. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk. And just so you know, like if you're in my congregation and you're like, well, how would Josh handle it? If you come into my office and you start yelling at me, I'm going to sit here, probably with this kind of look on my face, and I'm going to say, why don't you take a lap? Walk around our beautiful campus, go sit in your car for a little bit, bring the temperature down, and then you can come back and we can have a conversation. Because it is not productive for either of us to engage when that's the kind of approach we're taking. So, I felt like I should add those two. Anything else before we get to empty netters, Ben?
Nah, I think we're ready.
All right, you want to start us off?
Just grow up. This is a reminder to myself as much as anything. Like, there are real world implications to the things that we do. There are eternal implications to a lot of the things that we do. Just grow up.
I'm going to kind of echo that and say, do better. And I would, seriously reflect, is the way you behave, has anyone ever stopped coming to church because of the way you're acting? Because that's a problem. Have you stopped coming to church because of the way you're acting? Yeah. And we love you guys. And, here's the thing. Well, we put up with it to be a little lighthearted. We're also, we can be very immature as well. We're not, sitting up on high horses saying everybody else has a problem. We got our problems, too. I have the sense of humor of a 13-year-old. It's... We're all working on this together. So, yeah. With that being said, brothers and sisters, go in peace. Serve the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Thank you for listening in to this episode of Cross-Checking, a ministry of Hope and Good Shepherd Lutheran Churches, where we strive to deepen your understanding of the faith and help apply it to daily life. If this podcast is helpful to you, rate the podcast, subscribe to us on your favorite platform, and share it with others who might also gain something from it.